Welcome, soyez les bienvenus. I'm Amanda Ellis, the Director of Global Partnerships at the ASU Julian Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory and a member of the advisory board of the Global Governance Forum. It's my very great honor and pleasure to welcome you all here today for this closing session of the United Nations 75th Global Governance Forum. People from all over the world have joined us the last 3 days for what has really been an extraordinary exchange around the UN we need and the future we want. So it's wonderful to have this illustrious group with us this morning. We have a fabulous program for you. It will be in 3 parts. The first will be welcome remarks from Natalie Samarasinghe, who is representing Fabrizio Hochschild, the Undersecretary General and the Assistant to the UN Secretary General for the 75th preparations, and also Ambassador Donald Steinberg. Next, we will move to a discussion from the authors of the brilliant book, Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century, Augusto Lopez-Claros, Maja Groff, and L Dahl. And then in the final session, where we hope you will all engage actively in discussion with us, we will have an incredible lineup of global experts on global governance. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Natalie Samarasinghe, who is the Chief Strategist to the UN Undersecretary General and Assistant to the Secretary General for the preparations for the celebrations of the 75th anniversary of these United Nations. Natalie, the floor is yours. We're so delighted to welcome you.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and apologies for having such long job titles. We do struggle to fit them on our business cards. It's wonderful to join this forum again after a fantastic human rights session yesterday, and to speak at this particular session as I have had the privilege to get a few glimpses over the past 3 years into the development of this book. But today, as Amanda said, I'm representing the Undersecretary General Fabrizio Hochschild. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join, and he sends his deep, deep regrets. And so I thought it would be best to read out the remarks that were prepared for him for this occasion, which I will do now. Thank you very much for this opportunity to join you for this event on global governance and the emergence of global institutions for the 21st century. I'm deeply grateful to the Stimson Center and Augusto Lopez-Claros for this invitation. At the outset, I wish to congratulate Augusto and Maya and Arthur for this new book and for our collaboration throughout the UN's 75th anniversary. Our world has changed in so many ways since the UN was created in 1945. While the Secretary General did not want us to treat this anniversary as a celebration, we must not forget to acknowledge, as we talk about reforming and improving the UN, the achievements that we have made over the past 75 years. From supporting decolonization and the end of apartheid, to huge strides forward in life expectancy, living standards, and education, to international laws that boost human rights, gender equality, and environmental protection, life-saving assistance through our humanitarian agencies, and the eradication of diseases such as smallpox, and soon, we hope, polio. Of course, we must not forget the many times we have failed, and I have witnessed some of these failings over the course of my 3 decades with the organization. But still, we continue to feed, shelter, and protect millions of people every day and remain the only organization that brings together 193 member states to take action on the challenges we face and build a better future through the Sustainable Development Goals. 75 years after its creation, the UN and humanity face a number of challenges old and new, from the existential threats of climate change and nuclear weapons, to rapid changes in technology and demography, rising geopolitical tensions, deepening inequalities and social unrest, and now COVID-19, which has led to the first increase in global poverty in over 2 decades. The United Nations is expected to deal with all of these issues, but it faces its own challenges, increasingly overstretched and underfunded, with states disagreeing on how best to address the problems we face, and a rise in unilateralist rhetoric. As we have heard many times during this forum, thinkers, scholars, experts, and governments are speaking of a crisis of multilateralism. We are seeing less support for international institutions than before, as the world grapples with a growing sense of isolation and retreat from key international agreements and even institutions. This was a contradiction even before the pandemic, given the raft of challenges requiring action across borders. But the pandemic has made this situation even more clear and more absurd, highlighting the urgent necessity for multilateralism. We need to acknowledge that this crisis is also due to a growing sense that multilateralism has not delivered and is not delivering. For example, through the shortcomings of the Security Council to reach agreements on critical issues, or to perceived failings of the UN itself on the ground. It is against this backdrop that we launched the UN 75 initiative and embarked on a global listening tour. We have collected the views of over 1 million people and asked them how to achieve the future we want and the UN we need. Results show that there is overwhelming support from people for global cooperation, with over 87% of respondents saying it is vital to address the issues we face. We also conducted representative polling of 50,000 people in 50 countries. And here too, across all regions, age and social groups, we found the same strong support for multilateral institutions. But the big question is, how can we make the mechanisms that have worked well and sometimes not so well for the past 75 years more effective and relevant today? And how can we reimagine them? This question is of critical importance and at the heart of the UN 75 initiative. In that context, contributions like those of this book are valuable and thought-provoking. They offer suggestions on how to improve the UN, make it more relevant, effective, open, transparent, and transform our global governance system. And we very much welcome this debate of ideas. As a follow-up to our global consultation, the Secretary General will be tasked by member states on Monday, when they adopt a political declaration, to deliver ambitious ideas to upgrade the United Nations. These ambitious ideas are being gathered from far and wide and will be brought to the discussion. And I know that the ideas in your book will be useful. We hope that your book will launch new ideas, new conversations, and feed into our global listing exercise to modernize and upgrade the UN. Once again, I congratulate you all for this book and send you my deep gratitude for your valuable contributions to the UN 75th anniversary. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natalie, for reminding us of all the positive achievements. And I know what is very dark time for many, looking at all the wonderful participants in the chat from Berlin, from Nigeria, from London, from Canada, and self-described from climate-ravaged California. And I think that really does remind us just of this particular moment in time where COVID-19 has really thrown into stark relief these two important concepts of how interconnected we are as a world and how important it is for us to remember that. And of course, the exponential rate of negative change if we don't address issues like COVID-19 and the climate crisis in a timely fashion. So global governance in the 21st century lies at the very heart of all the issues we are debating right now. And I'm holding up this extraordinary book so that everybody is able to see. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Donald Steinberg from the United States, who is going to say a few words about the book before introducing our three co-authors. Ambassador Steinberg has had a very illustrious career, including as Deputy Administrator of USAID and being very involved now on the chair of the board of the Women's Refugee Commission. Ambassador Steinberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amanda. And this is my copy of the book as well. It is 540 pages long. And when I was sent the draft of the book, I have to acknowledge that I used up 3 yellow highlighters while reading it. And so I was delighted to be invited to write a blurb for the back of the book. And I think it's probably easiest for me just to read that blurb at this point, where I said that global governance and the emergence of global institutions for the 21st century documents the existential challenges facing our global institutions, from environmental decline and failure of international security mechanisms to mass population flows and the crisis of sovereignty and civil society engagement. This resulting landscape would seem hopeless and overwhelming if it weren't for the innovative, wide-ranging, and thought-provoking recommendations for reshaping the existing institutions to expand their relevance and their effectiveness. The ideas that the authors present include updating 60-year-old structures, such as the Security Council, the International Monetary Fund. They propose establishing a civil society chamber, which is essential to ensure that marginalized populations, including women, people with disabilities, displaced persons, the LGBT population, and indigenous peoples are fully engaged as participants and leaders of the international community. I said that readers may not endorse every one of their suggestions, but they are invited into a fascinating game of what if and why not. And it's an invitation that shouldn't be missed. And thank goodness we have the opportunity to hear from the authors today and play that game. So thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Steinberg. And what a wonderful opportunity to hear from our 3 authors today. Everyone who joined the session read the description, that very first question. Is there any hope for those who despair at the state of the world and the powerlessness of governments to find a way forward? And I must say, having been New Zealand's ambassador to the United Nations and served on the Security Council as co-chair for humanitarian access into Syria, it was a very sobering experience. And this book really did give me hope for very practical solutions and ways in which we can design and develop the existing architecture to build forward better, in the words of IMF CEO Kristalina Georgieva. So we're looking forward to a more inclusive and innovative future. And we have just the 3 brilliant thought leaders to help take us through that. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, Augusto Lopez-Claros, who is the chair of the Global Governance Forum and has held many senior positions in international organizations as an esteemed economist at the IMF, at the World Economic Forum, and at the World Bank. And Augusto is also an international gender expert and has been such a champion for the voice of women and minorities. Augusto, wonderful to have you with us, and the floor is yours. Augusto, yes.
I would like to begin my brief remarks by sharing with the audience something about the sources of inspiration for this book. I was in my 20s, as I remember, when I came upon the work of Granville Clark in World Peace Through World Law, first published by Harvard University Press in 1958. Clark had been very active in the debates leading to the establishment of the United Nations, and deeply regretted that coming out of San Francisco in 1945, we did not get a stronger United Nations, actually empowered to deliver on the promises of the Charter, against the background of 60 million fatalities during World War II. Clark had written that in an increasingly interdependent world, we needed to take the next step, the next logical step, through the establishment of institutions, and I quote, on a world scale corresponding to those which have been found essential for the maintenance of law and order in local communities and nations. Albert Einstein was also very active in these debates. In 1947, he gave a radio interview in which he said, the method of representation at the United Nations should be considerably modified. The moral authority of the United Nations would be considerably enhanced if the delegates were elected directly by the people, instead of being diplomats, in most cases representing the party in power. Einstein thought that the democratic legitimacy of the United Nations was a vital principle and that we needed to establish a formal linkage between the organization and the people it was meant to serve. In this respect, Einstein was strongly supportive of Clark's call to give the United Nations General Assembly, under a system of weighted voting, not one country, one vote, narrowly defined powers on matters pertaining to peace and security, which is, of course, the heart of the UN Charter. Bertrand Russell was another active participant in these debates. Not only did he collaborate closely with Einstein, but with the mind of a logician and a mathematician, which he was, he once said, wars will cease when and only when it becomes evident beyond reasonable doubt that any war, the aggressor will be defeated. And this was Russell's way of suggesting that Article 43 of the Charter, which calls for armed forces, assistance, and facilities to be made available to the Security Council for the purposes of maintaining peace and security, would need to be given operational meaning on the ground by creating the instrumentality to allow the UN to deliver on its peace and security mandate, which of course it hasn't always been able to do during its 75-year history. And last but not least, I would like to mention as an additional source of inspiration, the head of the Baha'i community, Shoghi Effendi, who in 1931 said, the fundamental cause of world unrest is our failure to adjust our system of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a rapidly evolving age. A statement, it seems to me, that remains as true today as it was 89 years ago when he first put forward a vision of greater international cooperation to strengthen our wobbly world order. All of these statements by these renowned thinkers highlight one fundamental irony of our age. In the last 75 years, the world has changed beyond recognition. Some of these changes have been linked to the swift expansion of connectivity and complexity brought about by rapid technological and scientific innovation. Others have been in response to rapid population growth and the associated expansion of the global economy. And although these forces have contributed to rising living standards and reductions in extreme poverty, they have also delivered a host of other problems, such as climate change, which you mentioned in your introductory remarks, and its many ramifications: nuclear proliferation, widening income disparities, a vulnerable global financial system, precarious health systems, as has been made eloquently clear during the COVID-19 crisis of the last 6 months. And it seems to me the institutions that we have, such as we have them, are struggling to cope with the challenges of an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world, because they have indeed failed to adapt to the needs of a rapidly evolving age. And the consequences of all of this is that major planetary issues are being neglected, and we're risking being overwhelmed by a broad range of problems, the solutions to which require effective problem-solving mechanisms and institutions. In the book, which you have shown to our participants, my co-authors Arthur and Maja and I argue that the time is ripe today to think creatively and proactively about modernizing our current UN-based global order. We need to strengthen our political and institutional structure so that our societies will be better able to cope with the kind of destabilizing shocks which have now become the new normal, such as COVID-19. Our current global order has few credible defenders. We have not seen in the course of the research leading up to this book plausible arguments to the effect that we can simply just muddle through for the next 25 years and that somehow the current system will deliver solutions to the problems that we face. Indeed, the emergent view is that we live in a world in which no one is in charge, and in which, because of these, we're being constantly surprised by global catastrophes, from the near implosion of the global financial system 10 years ago to COVID-19 today in 2020, which has exposed just how vulnerable and fragile our economic and our other systems are. Indeed, I think I have heard you say, Amanda, in another setting, that the COVID-19 is the precursor, the antechamber, to an acceleration of climate change in coming years and all the problems that that will bring. So the book essentially is a detailed look about what this all means for the future of global governance. We think that the years ahead, leading to the United Nations first century, represent a period of immense opportunity. Science and technology have enabled levels of cooperation that would have been impossible in earlier times, and this will open unparalleled prospects for progress. We argue that we must rise to the challenge of these opportunities because not doing so will put at risk our future and the future of our children. The only option left to us as we face our challenging future is to strengthen the machinery of international cooperation as we endeavor to find lasting solutions to the problems of our age. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Augusto. And I'm seeing in the chat some fantastic comments. Corey Bruot is totally with you with this point of the recognition of interdependence and the architecture that is no longer fit for purpose. And I think the past few days where we have seen such engagement, and as Natalie said, over 1 million people, we are beginning to see this interest in a much more inclusive and innovative international architecture. Augusto, I know you are so incredibly knowledgeable, and we look forward to bringing you back again as part of the Q&A at the end of the session. I wanted to comment before introducing Maja Groff about the stark relief we have seen COVID-19 really show us in relation to national governance. And it is extraordinary that some 40% of the successful responses to COVID-19 have come from 7% of world leaders represented by women. And I see we have Laura Liswood from the Council of Women World Leaders here, so look forward to engaging with you later, Laura. This issue of gender equality is such an important one on this 25th anniversary of the Beijing platform. And I could not be more delighted to introduce Maja Groff, who is an international lawyer based in The Hague. Maja has served at a range of international legal institutions, holds degrees from Oxford, from Harvard and McGill, and currently is a visiting professor at Leiden University, Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs. Maja, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you all of you joining us today for this conversation. So as the international lawyer on the book team, I will very briefly describe some of the proposals we make for international legal enhancements. And as a quick disclaimer, I'm speaking today, of course, in my individual capacity and not on behalf of any organization. So we propose in the book a sort of package upgrade to key parts of the international legal architecture. And for your information, there's just been a short policy brief released by Stimson this week on near-term international legal architecture upgrades, which I'll share in the chat box. So it's a sort of a shorter iteration if you don't have time to read the whole book, but I hope you do engage. The book is also available online, open source. So the proposals laid out in the book include, firstly, a suggestion that there needs to be a serious discussion about updating and enhancing the functionality of the International Court of Justice, making it a mandatory court directly connected to UN membership, and also relatedly a focus on the strengthening of Chapter 6 of the Charter on the peaceful settlement of disputes. So currently, under the so-called optional clause of the International Court of Justice statute, only about 40% of the UN membership have accepted the jurisdiction, general jurisdiction of the ICJ. And by now, the procedural sophistication, more modern international courts and dispute resolution processes has really outpaced the core dispute settlement features of the UN Charter negotiated over 75 years ago. So there's a lot of room to simply modernize to keep pace with current developments. We also propose that the International Criminal Court should be strengthened, and we should collectively push the very basic expectation that it should be a mandatory court also connected to UN membership to prosecute war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. These should be very basic expectations of all members of the international community. We also support the creation of an international anti-corruption court championed by Judge Wolf, who is on this panel today. And we feel that this could be a significant new institutional feature in the international system. Think, for example, of the range of international security problems, human rights abuses, and geopolitical issues linked to corruption at high levels. Also, very logically, the UN human rights architecture needs to be further consolidated, enhanced, and modernized. Relatedly, funding levels to UN human rights bodies needs to increase. At the moment, although considered one of the key pillars of the UN, it gets about 4% or less of the UN regular budget. So we are suggesting convening a high-level group to consider how to architect and chart feasible pathways to binding judicial review mechanisms for international human rights obligations, which were indeed Eleanor Roosevelt's view upon the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights many years ago. Finally, the last point I'll mention is we propose an International Judicial Training Institute to better support the very important work of international courts and judges, so that, for example, international judges are better prepared for the scale and complexity of many cases, which are undertaken in multilingual intercultural environments, among other challenges. Also, due to the fact that international law is still insufficiently taught at the national level. So I would suggest that such enhancements are incremental and are of a technical nature, and some, like the strengthening of the ICJ, are very overdue. Moreover, there have been very clear and unanimous international political statements on the importance of the rule of law at the national and international levels, which are unambiguous. For example, the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document. You can also more recently look at the SDG 16. You can also look at the political declaration, which will be adopted next week by the General Assembly. It's one of the first 4 points of action upon the UN 75th anniversary. So the international community, as Augusto and others have mentioned, is really facing a very challenging problem set at the moment, to say the least. And practically increasing the functionality of the international rule of law would increase the governance integrity of the whole international system. And I would argue that international law is by now mature enough, as is our technical, legal, and international institutional knowledge to design the next generation of fair and effective legal institutions. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
The next generation of fair legal institutions is indeed an excellent place to stop, and we're seeing a lot of comment in the chat applauding the recommendations that you've made, Maja. I think we can begin to realize just what a useful volume this is, given that there are very clear and practical solutions. And I think that's what really distinguishes this wonderful book. So you will have noticed too, we began with an economist, we moved to a lawyer, and now we are going to be moving to an environmental expert, so covering all 3 pillars of the Sustainable Development Goals. So L Dahl, you are the president of the International Environmental Forum, and an environmental scientist with nearly 50 years experience in intergovernmental organizations and in the UN system. You have been participating in the major UN conferences on environment and sustainability since Stockholm in 1972. So who better than L Dahl to now address us? Thank you, Arthur. The floor is.
Thank you very much. I should like to look at these issues about governance of the global environment. The founders of the United Nations could never have imagined today's environmental threats to our security. A complex environmental crisis is facing the planet as we overshoot planetary boundaries for global heating, biodiversity loss, land use change, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, pollutants, and many other things. We're raping the planet's resources with no concern for the future. This is one of the clearest rationales for global governance of our common global system. We have ignored calls to strengthen global governance for too long. Now the planet itself is warning us to act rapidly to transform our whole society and avoid catastrophe. The pandemic has highlighted our interdependence and the injustices of the present system, where the poor lose the most, including from environmental destruction. We cannot afford the present global anarchy, where the best efforts of some of us are neutralized, if not reversed, by the careless actions of others. But despite the urgency, the inertia of our present system and vested interests are still blocking change, demonstrating by the continuous lack of political will. The priority given to the short term and to political self-interest, reinforced by widespread corruption, are symptoms of the lack of governance and any sense of our common humanity at the global scale of the problems. Global environmental governance has the same requirements as any good governments at any other level. We need global mechanisms to adopt binding legislation, an executive capacity for enforcement, and means for judicial review. This should be supported by strong scientific advisory and technology assessment processes, including integration across issues for our complex planetary system, and reinforced by Chamber for Civil Society advisory to legislative process. Finally, there must be financial mechanisms to support the transformation towards sustainability and to assist those who need it, with penalties for shirkers. All of these are covered in our book. We're still open as to the precise form these functions could take, possibly a global environment agency. Or we could start with the UN Climate Change Organization to address that specific urgent problem, just as the European Union started with a coal and steel community. There is no time now for slow institutional evolution. So we need a peaceful but rapid and fundamental transformation, a clear break with the present system while building trust in the new institutions. This would also respond to the demands of youth to act now for their future. Acting on climate change could be the breakthrough in global governance that could pave the way for other reforms. A possible immediate step forward that would avoid all the obstacles of government resistance would be to go as far as possible with an expert, science-based process involving many actors to work out the framework for global environmental legislation on climate change. This would include, for instance, setting a boundary for greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, exploring formulae for sharing responsibility equitably, preparing country profiles for greenhouse gas emissions and absorptive capacities to determine country shares of global reductions, mapping carbon international trade to show carbon footprints beyond country borders, then calculating each country's share of emissions reductions and response capabilities to define the necessary financial help and technology transfer, calculating the cost of implementation, proposing funding mechanisms, and then preparing draft global legislation. This would show governments that the climate crisis can be addressed with equity and with global mechanisms that can be seen as just and earn the trust of all concerned. We're also presently working on an initial version of a global catastrophic risks index to show governments their priority risks calling for urgent action. In our overview of global needs in the book, we also consider population and migration, corruption, and the education needed for transformation, as well as the values and principles that should provide the foundation for a new global governance system. Finally, we suggest some immediate steps forward to get from here to there and to bridge the governance gap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. And certainly the founders of the United Nations could not have imagined 75 years on the catastrophic climate crisis we would be creating. And I know that our panelists are going to be addressing this issue, and we're seeing lots of questions in the chat about it also. One of the interesting things about the current COVID pandemic has been people have really begun to viscerally understand not only the notion of interconnectedness, which our participants have been commenting on, but also the notion of exponentiality. And the fact, if we think about the first 100 days that it took to have 1 million COVID cases, and here we are 5 months on with over 30 million cases. And now this is happening within a matter of days. And this is really what we need to be concerned about with climate and the tipping points too. Thank you, Arthur, for your comments on youth as well. I was listening to a session yesterday with the Secretary General's envoy on youth, Jayathma Wickramakatna, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, Wickramakatnayake, who talked about how important it is to have young people involved and engaged. So thank you so much for mentioning that too. Time now to move from our 3 illustrious authors to our wonderful panel, who will be discussing and debating these issues in more detail and engaging, of course, with our audience. So I'm going to quickly introduce all 5 panel members, and then we will work through on a number of themes. First of all, Professor Joseph Baratta, historian and author of the seminal, or should I say germinal, 2-volume text, The Politics of World Federation, back in 2004, but many, many ideas still pertinent today. Professor Maxine Burkett, who is at the University of Hawaii, a Wilson Center Global Fellow and co-founder of the Institute for Climate and Peace. Welcome, Maxine. Professor Maria Ivanova, who is with the Global Governance Directorate and is also the director of the Center for Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Welcome. Professor Robert Rotberg, who is the founding director of the Interstate Conflict Program at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and also a member of the board of Integrity Initiatives International. And finally, the Honorable Mark Wolf, Senior United States District Judge and the Chair of Integrity Initiatives International. So you can see we have an amazing lineup, and we're going to dive right in and begin with our first theme, which is the need to strengthen international cooperation and good governance to solve global problems. So Professor Baratta, I know that you've been having some issues and you're going to be using the phone. So we're going to try this out. Everyone who's been using virtual platforms know that there's always got to be some kind of technological hiccup. So we're going to see if we can manage to have both Professor Baratta on our visual, but responding by phone. So Professor Baratta, I want to start with a line from your book. An interdependent world needs to significantly strengthen international cooperation to solve global problems. And we have had so many comments in the chat saying, absolutely, this is the kernel of our debate today. So this assertion that you made in 2004 is just as relevant today as, or even more relevant than it was in 2004. And your book provides a very impressive overview of the concept of international cooperation and describes how this led to the United Nations. Tell us in your own words, are you personally more hopeful today than you were in 2004 that there is greater acceptance to rethink our current UN-based global order?
I'm a historian. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
I am a historian, and I tend to think, I understand things historically. For instance, I wonder how this UN 75 commemoration will be remembered in, say, 30 years. Will historians look back at the UN annual meeting of the General Assembly in 2020 as a moment when the states members came to grips with their global problems, like the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, destruction of biodiversity, slow progress of human rights, world poverty, unequal economic development, a new arms race, and civil wars affecting international security? Or will the conference disappear into the shadowy history of past well-meaning but insignificant efforts to revitalize the United Nations or to make serious departures in UN reform? It might help us to draw back and take a long view. I invite you to think historically. The short answer to your question, Ambassador Ellis, is there was nothing proposed in the UN 75 declaration, nor in the forum over the last 2 days, that imagined a General Assembly made representative of both states and peoples, nor a Security Council reduced to a Council of Regions of the Earth, or an executive of the laws of a democratic world legislature, nor an International Court of Justice enlarged into a judicial system for the enforcement of the world laws on individuals. But everywhere, aspirations were expressed for a more effective and participatory United Nations, without much idea about how practically that might be done, beyond handing over to the declaration to the states in the General Assembly for implementation in the next year as the Secretary General prepares the roadmap by September 2021. Yet the feeling is that the United Nations is evolving by interpretation of the Charter without amendment into a world system of voluntary cooperation of states that looks far different from the Big Five alliance of 1945. As I say in my history of the politics of world federation, a great novel work of statecraft is before us. Probably the lawful world system of the future will look as different from the historic federations as the U.S. federal government looked from the confederations and monarchies that preceded it. I'd like to look at a little evidence from the conference. Under planning, the Stimson document, UN 2.010 Innovations, plainly stated that they proposed nothing contentious or new. And they gave warning that countries may want to leverage the declaration for national political gain or to increase economic austerity measures. Moreover, it was said that timing is not right to advance ambitious reform agendas. States are liable to give only rhetorical support to the need to strengthen or reform the UN. civil society is seen by states as disruptive or too idealistic for member states. Then came the work of the UN 2020, a coalition of, or a smart coalition of Together First, which grew out of the United Nations Association of the United Kingdom and whatever is left of the old World Federalist movement in Ottawa and New York. Associated with them was the Alliance for Multilateralism founded by Germany, and has already drawn some 65 states together. So I thought that was, it's very impressive really that the powers have been assembled for this conference. Then there was prepared a People's Declaration dated in March, which was much more vigorous than the Stimson report. It had some 15 recommendations. I'd like to read one of them. We have drafted a solutions-based declaration, knowing that this moment represents humanity's best chance to imagine and create a stronger multilateralism. We call upon leaders of character and wisdom to act now in solidarity with present and future generations. The time has come for a process of rigorous, transparent, inclusive, and vitally nonpartisan assessment of global governance needs paired with a strategy to implement the results of this process. That was followed by the declaration dated in July, which was watered down until it was stripped of all concrete proposals. This is what will be presented to the states on Monday for their consideration as the Secretary General builds the roadmap in the next year. I'd like to read a passage from this. Strengthening international cooperation is in the interest of both nations and peoples. The three pillars of the United Nations, peace and security, development, and human rights, are equally important, interrelated, and interdependent. Now, I am watchful of what will happen to the declaration in the next year, and really we will have to see if civil society and other actors can contribute. I noticed in the Global Governance Forum in August and September that there was much greater experience and expertise that manifest in civil society, particularly on these several points. It creates, they are creating the setting for inspiring governments for the roadmap. Lastly, I'd just like to cite a few of the aspirational statements made in the last 2 days of the Global Governance Forum. These are interesting, and I will conclude with a summary of what they mean. For instance, it was said, youth deserves to have a place at the table. Or, the oneness of humanity has implications for domestic policy. Or, civil society pushes back as the United States of America withdraws. Just security enlarges the purpose of the United Nations. Partnerships show the way forward. We, the people, are the United Nations. I submit that these statements, these sentiments reflect a notion of the United Nations as an emerging popular world government, even though most speakers have no idea of what would be required constitutionally, and probably they would be resistant to such an interpretation. Thank you.
Amanda, is your sound working? Amanda, have we lost connection with you?
She must be frozen. Augusto, take over.
All right. I apologize for the technical mishap, but we seem to have lost Amanda temporarily. And I will go to Professor Rotberg, who is has already been introduced by Amanda. In your book on governance, you make the point that spreading good governance should be a key goal of political leaders, because better governed people are more likely to avoid civil conflict and obtain better social outcomes. What is needed to enhance the quality of governance at the international level, with particular reference to some of the more urgent global challenges we face, such as climate change, rising income disparities, great power tensions? If you could perhaps spend a few minutes on this, Robert, we would be most grateful.
Thank you, Augusto. I will, and it's important to follow what you've said. We can no longer muddle through in the hope of global governance doing its thing. We must begin to restructure, but specifically in answer to your questions, the key to improved national governance and global governance is improved leadership at the national level and at the international level. One of the most important crises affecting global governance and the world today is the loss of legitimate international leadership. The UN was created by esteemed leaders creating a path forward. We've lost that. So what we must do is encourage a new cadre of leadership at various places in the world. And I particularly want to take note of the fact that in 25 years, at the 100th anniversary of the UN, a full quarter of the people of the world will be Africans. And Africa is not well represented in the international forums now, and we should begin to look for leadership at the national level to move the international clock forward from Africa. We will also, I hope, have newly legitimized leadership in the United States and in the P5, because that's critical in changing the calculus for international governance and encouraging us to do less muddling and more restructuring, as you've called for, Augusto. Final point, I think, is that, as Maja has mentioned, one of the important new international institutions which could help in dealing with all kinds of problems in the world is an international anti-corruption court. Maja's mentioned it favorably as a new international institution, and I think it's one we should all put our minds behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Maxine, again, you have been introduced by Amanda, and I am temporarily taken over while she reconnects.
I'm back, Augusto, and I have a new computer. So thank you all for patience. Professor Baratta had audio issues and I had video issues. So apologies, and thank goodness for iPad backups. So it's wonderful to be able to come now to the real central issue of our time in terms of the climate challenge and the global commons. The IPCC estimates that we have less than 8 years in the global carbon budget. And yet, perversely, we're seeing IMF data from 2017 that's showing over $5 trillion a year in fossil fuel subsidies. It's totally perverse. So Professor Burkett, in a recent article in the journal Foreign Affairs, the Nobel laureate William Nordhaus argues that although climate change is the most important environmental challenge and perhaps the most important challenge facing the world today, the architecture being used is deeply flawed, and it relies on uncoordinated voluntary arrangements, which actually encourage free riding in international climate change agreements. So although the 2015 Paris Accords were indeed a significant achievement in terms of global agreement in principle, we see the COP26 postponed for a year, and as Nordhaus argues, the perverse incentive structure in these treaties means that the global effort to curb climate change, in his words, is sure to fail. What can we do to revamp our approach to management of our global commons?
Great, thank you, Amanda. First, aloha, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this conversation. I do want to underscore what we know, what we've seen. I'm from Jamaica originally, and so what has been a sort of prominent way of thinking about the moment we're in right now is that climate's at the starting blocks, right? If we think about the fact that we're seeing an acceleration, it has not hit full speed. And although we've set some targets in terms of the finish line, we know that we're going to blow right past it. So this is, it's sort of an understatement to say this is urgent. We also know, and some of the work that I do in thinking about peace and positive peace in particular, is that certain countries are better able to withstand shocks, right? We know free flow of information is critical for that, acceptance of the rights of others, incredibly critical, as well as equitable distribution of resources. So if we consider those inputs, what are the ways in which we're supporting countries in advancing that, especially when we think about the Global South? My particular disciplinary background is very much influenced by environmental justice here in the United States. And what we do is define the environment as where you live, work, and play, which means that any kind of legal infrastructure that we're looking at needs to actually address all of those areas in a meaningful way. And at the international level, if we're only dealing with climate change in the field broadly defined as international environmental law or international climate change law, we're missing critical elements of engagement. Where do we work? Where do we play as a community, a global community as well? And if we sort of zoom out, scale up, and understand that engagement and definition of environment, then we have a responsibility not only to have a climate infrastructure that is responsive to the race that we're in, but that we are also looking at other areas of international law, and in particular public and private economic law, as a key part and key levers for addressing climate change, and looking at the enforcement and compliance achievements in other areas of international law as a model for that. So flipping the script, understanding the diversity of levers, understanding that we can address climate change only through the prism of an international environmental law, and thinking about not only supporting the Global South in its journey, but supporting the Global North in its reduction, sort of flattening the overconsumption curve, if you will, right? There's an input here that we have ignored to date. And that I think will be important in terms of ensuring that vulnerability is not increased, especially in areas in the Global South, by the relationships we have currently existing and the compartmentalization that we see in our international law infrastructure. So I'll stop there.
Right. Fantastic. Thank you, Maxine. And I'd now like to move to Professor Maria Ivanova and to continue on this very important issue of effective climate action. How do you see the current system of global governance? And knowing that we have commitments in the Paris Agreement, and yet those commitments are not being adhered to, can you help us try to understand what is stopping us from doing what we all know actually needs to be done?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ellis, for bringing me into this conversation. It is truly an honor to be part of this panel that brings the notion of institutions to the forefront and features the individuals within them and the individuals that are thinking about them. As a Bulgarian who grew up behind the Iron Curtain and has experienced the power of education as a tool to break down barriers, I deeply appreciate the opportunity to think about a different system. But also as the chair of the jury of the new SHAPE Prize by the Global Challenges Foundation, where the three authors of this outstanding book, Augusto, Maja, and Arthur, as well as Natalie Samarasinghe, were among the winners. I am proud to see the evolution of these ideas, and I'm eager to work on their implementation. So in terms of the climate issues, bottlenecks and barriers are some critical concepts. Bottlenecks are what creates delays and often higher costs. They slow us down. Barriers, however, block and impede movement. They keep us from passing through, and we have to knock them down or find another way of going through. So technology and financing are bottlenecks. Innovation and creativity can allow us to tackle them. And we often do that. And we hear a lot of calls for climate action through innovation, through creativity. And we see that around us. We see that at the local level, at the national level, the state level, the regional level, and to a certain extent at the global level as well. But those are the mechanisms that allow us to move through the bottlenecks. The barriers, however, the socioeconomic constructs around the wants and priorities of us as humans, they are the barriers. Humans as individuals and humans as societies. These socioeconomic constructs shape what we consume and how, what we produce and how, and what and how and where we dispose. And I emphasize the where because our disposal habits now spread around the world. I work with a lot of graduate students, PhD students in global governance and human security. I hope that many of them are here in the audience today. And with some of them, we work on plastics. How plastics is consumed, how it is produced, and how it is disposed are very different issues. And this is where the fossil fuels of today are going with our reduction of behavior that requires more fossil fuels. We are pushing those fossil fuels into plastics. So how do we govern this? But I'd like to end on this. Ultimately, climate change is a wicked problem. It cannot be resolved once and for all. It requires what people here in Boston, where I'm based, call wicked smart solutions. Those are the solutions that evolve and become better all the time as the problems themselves evolve. And so indeed, what is stopping us from doing what we know needs to be done, and to be tackled is the fundamental agreement with the notion that the more, the better. If we disagree with that, we are going to change. And so the current crisis we live in is pushing us to think differently. So I agree with Professor Rotberg, we need transformational leadership. We not only need leadership, we need transformational leadership. And we need to invest in a transformation of mindsets. To acknowledge the barriers and to knock them down, we need to invest and engage with education in new and fundamentally different innovative ways. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ivanova. I love that wicked smart solutions. And it is enlightening when we look at some of the local solutions. And Maxine and I both live here in Hawaii, which is the first state to have recommitted to the Paris Accords when the United States withdrew. And what is so exciting is that 23 other states have actually followed suit. So even if we are seeing a failure of global governance and action, we are seeing local solutions and local action. The points too that you made about socioeconomic constructs are excellent ones, and particularly plastics. We know that ExxonMobil, for example, has indicated that they will be increasing their output by 25% in the next 10 years on the basis of projected demand for plastics. Now, I didn't know until a few years ago that, in fact, plastics were made from fossil fuels. So education, as you say, is absolutely critical so that all of us are very conscious of how we are consuming and, as you said, where things are actually going to be disposed of. So thank you. We will come back to this very important issue soon. And I'd like you to be thinking about the role of non-state actors in this intergovernmental system, which was a question that came through from Maureen Pouget. Maxine also mentioned this notion of just transition. And I'd like to move now to our third theme around justice and corruption. And my question now is for the Honorable Mark Wolf, Judge Wolf. The authors that you have heard from today, Augusto, Maja, and Arthur, dedicate an entire chapter of their book to the problem of corruption. And you are really a global expert on this area. They describe it as a destroyer of human prosperity. And in your own writings, you have brought attention to the way in which corruption undermines the democratic process, the way in which corruption contributes to political instability in the world and makes governance more difficult. You are also the founder of a very important international organization, Integrity Initiatives International. Please tell us about how you and the organization are addressing the critical issue of corruption.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Augusto, Maja, and Arthur, for your exceptional book, for this program, and for the opportunity to be on it. And thank you, of course, for the very insightful and compelling way you describe why the world needs an international anti-corruption court, which is a focus of the mission of Integrity Initiatives International, or III as we call it. III was founded in 2016 by Dr. Robert Rotberg, myself, Richard Goldstone, Justice Goldstone of South Africa, the first prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, to combat grand corruption. Grand corruption is the abuse of public office for private gain by a nation's citizens, coming to commonly be called kleptocrats. And we perceived that there was an important gap, not just in the international framework, but in the discussion, because our focus is on the importance of strengthening the enforcement of criminal laws against those kleptocrats. Grand corruption, as everybody on this panel knows, has devastating consequences. There have been frequent references today to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the inception, Justice Goldstone and I published opinion pieces. Lloyd Axworthy, the former foreign minister of Canada, and his colleague Alan Rock, the former Canadian ambassador to the United Nations, published a comparable piece. And we all predicted, unfortunately, prophetically, that the pandemic would be a bonanza for kleptocrats, because as trillions of dollars are being dispersed without even the usual ineffective safeguards. We have evidence now from Brazil to the Balkans and far beyond that high officials are shamelessly stealing and misappropriating and misusing a large percentage of that money. And we've also had considerable discussion this morning, for very good reasons, about climate change. But grand corruption is closely associated with climate change. I'm not expert, but it's my understanding that that illicit trade in forestry is estimated to be about $13 billion a year, and kleptocrats from Malaysia to Cambodia to Honduras profit from that. Almost any problem that the United Nations would be concerned with has as its root grand corruption. There are refugee crises across the world, and these are refugees fleeing failed corrupt states. And of course, human rights abuses, as the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, said the amount lost to corruption every year would be enough to feed the world's hungry 80 times over. It's important to realize that, or recognize that grand corruption doesn't exist because of a lack of laws. Grand corruption exists. The 187 countries are parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption. They all have laws that make bribery and extortion and misappropriation, money laundering, criminal offenses. But kleptocrats have impunity in their own countries because they control the police, the prosecutors, and the courts. And they won't permit the investigation and punishment of their families, their friends, and themselves. So Integrity Initiatives International, and now many others, advocate the creation of an international anti-corruption court, somewhat similar to, but separate from the International Criminal Court, to enforce existing criminal laws or a uniform international counterpart of them against kleptocrats who have impunity in their own countries, to enforce those laws when a country is unwilling or unable to enforce them itself against its highest leaders. The court, like the ICC, would operate on the principle of complementarity. So as I said, only if a country was unwilling or unable to prosecute would the IACC assert jurisdiction and prosecute. We've heard a lot, for good reasons, about the need to change and improve leadership. And kleptocrats don't permit free and fair elections. The people who bribe them also finance their campaigns because they profit from those kleptocrats being in office. But successful prosecutions would result in the imprisonment of kleptocrats and the opportunity for the democratic process to elect successors who are dedicated to serving their citizens rather than enriching themselves. There's been reference today, again, for very good reason, to the Sustainable Development Goals. The IACC would be a vehicle for generating and repatriating funds that are necessary to address those goals. When I impose a criminal sentence in a fraud or corruption case, it involves an order of restitution or disgorgement. And that could be a feature of any criminal case in the IACC. In addition, the IACC could have jurisdiction over civil cases like False Claims Act cases in the United States, where private whistleblowers bring suit. If they prevail, money is recovered for the governments and the people who've been victimized, as well as for those organizations. With regard to the United Nations, in 2019, after having been one of 5 or 6 countries that called on the United Nations to convene the special session on corruption that's now scheduled for June next year, Colombia called upon the UN to advance the idea of the International Anti-Corruption Court. There's a major movement in Canada led by Lloyd Axworthy and Alan Rock and many others to have Canada soon join this effort. Many NGOs like Transparency International, Human Rights Watch, Global Witness, Century support it, and so do many young people, courageous young people around the world. And one of III's prongs of its mission is to forge a network of these young people who are dedicated to combating corruption in their own countries and around the world. So it's really a wonderful opportunity to learn from all of you today.
Thank you, Judge Wolf. That actually does answer one of the questions, which was, what can those in the audience do to support this initiative? And you've just answered that. So thank you so much. I am going to be coming back to all of you. We have just about 15 minutes left. So I'd like to move now back to Professor Burkett. Vision 2020 for UN 75 and beyond actually references the links to climate and peace, which really have not been to the forefront. This issue just got on the Security Council agenda for the first time last February. Tell us a little bit about why you founded the Institute for Climate and Peace and what one thing those in the audience might be able to do in very practical terms.
Thanks, Amanda. That's a great question. And I actually, when thinking about the Institute for Climate and Peace and its creation, had been inspired by my colleague who, and dear friend, Maja Groff, who is a peace advocate and educator, and was really sharing a lot about the tenets of positive peace, which is not just the absence of conflict, but the conditions and institutions that support the sort of a sustained state of peaceful relations and right relations. And some of the major indicators of that I noted it earlier in the earlier question, and low levels of corruption is one of those things. Obviously, there are about 8 or so that are sort of high level necessary elements in order for societies to thrive. But again, that resilience to external shocks being a big part of it. There's also a fundamental overlap in the way we were thinking about justice and just transitions in the climate change context and what positive peace requires. There's an incredible overlap in the notions of conflict transformation rather than conflict resolution. How do we get to a sort of a quantum leap in our way of engaging and ensuring rights, for example, and the equitable distribution of resources? I also do a lot of work in the issues of migration and climate, what's sort of more commonly called the climate refugee problem. And we were looking at the way the phenomenon is being both framed and the solutions that are being offered, and recognizing that there's a securitization that's happening in that conversation that looks less at the needs of those in transition, the sending communities, their desires, the host communities, and more at the sort of the strengthening of borders, which itself can cause a lot of distress and disarray. And so we were thinking, what would it mean to actually have actionable items that advance positive peace, that are sound, enduring climate solutions? And that was the origin story of the Institute for Climate and Peace. Now, what are we looking at specifically to do that work? Sort of briefly, I will say that we brought host communities together with communities that are finding themselves in increased transition in the Pacific to have conversations about how we might envision a new type of community given the changes that we're seeing as a result of climate. So I know there are others who want to speak. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you. I wish we had another hour. You've all got such incredible knowledge to impart. I would love now to move to some of the questions, and I know that each of you are going to end with one thing that you would like the audience to take away from our discussion today. A question from Chris Greenwood. How are we going to transform the UN of today, and particularly pointing up to the Security Council, the P5? And yesterday, a student from South Africa said, how is this body relevant anymore? The whole continent of Africa has no representation, which is a great point. So I would love to ask one of our esteemed panelists to address that question of reform of the Security Council. Do I have a volunteer? Nobody. Okay, so that is just in the too hard basket. Yes, thank you. Professor Baratta.
Yes, I'd like to respond briefly to that. I'm impressed by a response to that of one of the founders of the United World Federalists at congressional hearings back in 1948. Cord Meyer was asked if he could only make one change in the United Nations, what should it be? And he replied, do not attempt to abolish the veto. Rather, make the General Assembly representative of people.
Very interesting point.
Yes, do you understand?
Yes.
The force of that is that it would introduce a democratic element into the United Nations, and the power of the people, if present in the General Assembly, as in a second chamber, well, they would exert the kind of influence or popular pressure.
Yes, and thank you. I know the authors actually did suggest and call for the creation of a World Parliamentary Assembly in an advisory role, and as well as making the case for the creation of an international peace force. But this whole point about how, in fact, we could have a World Parliamentary Assembly is a really critical one. So thank you so much for raising that. I have another question here about the trend of international institutional design being increasingly related to voluntarism. And a question about how might a shift to greater formalization and strengthening of binding international law, as Maja outlined, mandatory ICJ and ICC take place. Maja, would you like to have a crack at that one, please?
Sure. Yeah, I think you see various trends, and it goes up and down, and you have trends towards more binding and enforceable international law in some areas, and trends in other areas towards voluntarism, for example, in the climate area. But I think we also have to sort of diagnose the reasons sometimes for those trends, which might have to do, for example, with large economic interests, like the lobbying dimensions in the climate and the industrial sort of dimensions there. So just to make the point that we have some excellent institutions and models for very intelligent, strong monitoring and enforcement systems for international law, which can be recreated in other spheres. For example, the OPCW on chemical weapons, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and there are other examples. The International Criminal Court also, which can still be improved, and there's still much discussion. So just to say that there's a lot of modern international law, which is very sound, moving really much more towards a genuine rule of law. So the voluntary trend is not necessarily dominant.
Thank you very much. We are now only a few minutes to go, and I know we're going to get cut off. So I would like to move back to everybody for one quick line, 30 seconds or less. If you could ask our audience to do one thing in support of the particular area of expertise that you represent, what would it be? And Judge Wolf, you've already told us, so I will give you a pass. So, Professor Rotberg, is there one thing that you would like the audience to take away?
Yes, the answer to the future of global governance and the reform of the Security Council must come from our audience and all individual participants to strengthen the civil society impact on leadership and to keep leaders accountable for their actions.
Thank you. Power to the people. I love it. Professor Ivanova.
Well, in academia, we think in threes. So therefore, I have 30 seconds for three things. One is responsibility. That is both individual and collective. Two is accountability. We need a commitment to mutual accountability, collective mutual accountability. And three, education as the vehicle that would deliver the responsibility and the mutual accountability. Underlining all of that is the fundamental value of solidarity.
Thank you so much. And now to our three authors. We're going to start with Arthur, Maja, and end with Augusto. Arthur.
I think we've tried to show in our book that there are practical ways forward to working global governance to address our problems. And I think if everybody starts working to build whatever we can, as the pressures increase for change, because things are going to get worse. And at some point, there will be a breaking point where we can move through and build a much better future. And I think let's not be pessimistic. Let's say, let's start building now, and the pressures will help to open the door for us to advance in this positive direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Maja.
Yes, I would echo Arthur's message of capability, capacity, that we have incredible foundations already in the international system. We've achieved a lot. And I think that if we focus really on our shared values and really look at the charter, look back at the charter, and its key principles are still incredibly sound, and we just have to take the next logical steps. So I just encourage people to look at that rule of law package, and ideally we should have a smart coalition with the Alliance for Multilateralism to make that happen.
Thank you. And now, Augusto, you have the final word. Augusto Lopez-Claros, the chair of the Global Governance Forum. Augusto, you need to unmute.
Thank you, Amanda. First of all, let me thank you for moderating this panel in such a wonderful and efficient way. You know, as I think over the last 20 years, one of the more encouraging developments is the extent to which civil society has been empowered by technology and just by developments overall. It has emerged as a very important catalyst for change. The International Criminal Court, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Treaty on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, all of these initiatives, which are perhaps the most important initiatives of international cooperation over the last 20 years, would not have been possible without the support of civil society. So as we move forward in implementing some of the proposals that have been put forth in our book, we look forward very much to engaging with civil society, with women's organizations, with young people, because I think that they are the ones who eventually will go out into the streets and will demand that governments establish a new basis for managing the world in a better way than we have been doing over the last 75 years.
What a brilliant note on which to end. And I thank our authors, our panelists, and our UN representatives. Apologies for my technological problems, and to those who had questions I had promised to get to. I'm so sorry, with my new computer log on, I wasn't able to see all of them. So I'm hoping you can connect with our panelists directly. And I'm seeing this from Nigeria. I love this book. Adewale says, recommend to everybody. What a wonderful way on which to finish. Thank you so much, everybody. And we'll look forward to next week's official celebrations and commemorations and ways forward to a better and more collaborative world with the Secretary General. Thank you all.
Thank you all.